The storm rolled over Raven Mesa like a living thing, wind howling, lightning clawing at the black sky. Eli Barrett kicked open his cabin door when he saw the glow on the horizon. Fire. The Comanche camp was burning. He grabbed his rifle, boots crunching wet earth, heart hammering like a war drum. Somewhere in that chaos were Chief Makoa's daughters, Lena and Maris. He told himself once, never again. Never again would he risk his life for anyone. Not after last time. But his rifle was already in his hands. And his horse was already saddled. Once, long ago, Eli Barrett had been a different man. Before his name turned into a whisper, before his eyes grew cold and heavy, before he became a ghost haunting the edges of Raven Mesa, he wore a sheriff's badge. Back then, Eli believed. He believed in law. He believed in people. He believed that if a man stood tall enough and fast enough, if his word was as sharp as his Colt, he could hold back the chaos of the frontier. Dry Creek had been his town. A crooked line of saloons, feed stores, and weather-beaten homes strung along a dusty main street. He'd walk it every morning, boots tapping wood and dirt, tipping his hat to ranch wives and merchants, nodding to old-timers sipping bitter coffee on porches. He laughed easy back then, slept through the night, even believed, in his quiet way, that he might one day have a family of his own. And then came that night. It was supposed to be simple. An escort job, nothing more. A preacher, his wife, and 2 small children headed west with all they owned in a weathered wagon. Bandits had been spotted along the canyon road, so Eli swore he'd get them through. He'd done it a dozen times before. But that night, the world turned against him. The crickets had gone silent. There'd been a strange tang in the wind, like smoke hidden beneath the sage. Eli should have known. Every instinct in his bones had screamed turn back, but he hadn't listened. He walked them straight into an ambush. It happened fast. The snap of a rifle, the preacher's cry, horses screaming in terror. Shadows erupted from the rocks like devils, 6 of them, maybe 7, faces wrapped in dirty scarves. Eli dropped 2 before they hit the wagon, but there were too many, coming too fast. By the time his last bullet found its mark, it was over. The wagon lay on its side, a wheel still spinning. The preacher and his family lay scattered in the dust. And Eli, breathing like a dying man, stood in the silence that followed, hands shaking so badly he couldn't reload. He buried them himself under the shade of a lone oak tree, carrying stones from the riverbed to mark their graves. Took all night. At dawn, he set his sheriff's badge atop the preacher's mound and walked away. That was 6 years ago. Since then, Eli had carved out a life at the far edge of Raven Mesa, where red rock met endless sky. Out here, the wind carried no judgment, and the land made no demands. He built a small cabin from rough-hewn pine, worked a modest spread of cattle, and lived by the rhythm of the seasons. No neighbors, no friends, no promises, just Eli and Duke. Duke was a one-eyed cattle dog with a crooked paw and a stubborn heart. Eli had found him half dead in a trap years back, bones sharp beneath his hide, snarling weakly even as Eli freed him. Since then, Duke had never left his side. On quiet evenings, the dog would sit on the porch beside him, one good eye fixed on the horizon like he was guarding the edge of the world. Eli didn't talk much anymore, not even to Duke. Some days, he wouldn't hear his own voice until sundown. At night, the ghosts came. Sometimes he dreamed of the canyon road, of gunfire blooming like lightning, of children's cries cut short. Sometimes he woke before dawn, revolver in hand, heart hammering against his ribs, convinced he was still there, still too late. It wasn't living, but it wasn't dying either. It was penance. Once every few weeks, Eli would ride into Dry Creek for supplies. The townsfolk would fall quiet when he passed. Some looked away. Others stared too long. A few spat into the dirt, calling him killer under their breath. No one had forgiven him. Eli didn't expect them to. He bought what he needed, flour, cartridges, tobacco, then rode back into the wild without a word. He didn't belong in Dry Creek anymore. Didn't belong anywhere. He told himself he liked it that way. Out here on Raven Mesa, The land was vast enough to swallow a man whole. Days bled into weeks, weeks into years, until he became part of the landscape. Another weathered thing left behind by time. And maybe, if he stayed quiet long enough, fate would forget about him. But fate has a way of remembering. One spring morning, as the first green crept timidly through the sage, 3 riders crossed the dry gulch near his land. The wind carried the dust before them, their silhouettes sharp against the rising sun. Eli leaned against his porch post, one hand resting on the worn stock of his rifle, watching them approach. Comanche. 2 were young women, riding lean Appaloosas with plaited manes. Between them rode an older man, broad-shouldered and proud, his braids threaded with bone and copper beads that flashed like fire when the light struck them. They stopped a dozen yards from Eli's cabin. The older man dismounted first. His movements were slow, deliberate, the kind of deliberate that comes from carrying authority your whole life. "My name is Makoa," he said in accented but steady English. "These are my daughters, Lena and Maris." Lena, the elder, had a stillness about her, a quiet strength, her gaze as steady as stone. Maris was the opposite. Restless, curious, her wild dark eyes skipping across everything at once, like a caged hawk straining against the wind. Eli said nothing. He wasn't in the business of strangers. Makoa didn't waste words. "The red jackals are hunting us," he said simply. "They want my daughters." Eli's grip tightened on his rifle. The red jackals, he'd heard the name whispered in Dry Creek. Raiders, outlaws, killers without code or honor, riding beneath a banner painted with fangs and blood. Makoa stepped closer, meeting Eli's eyes. "I heard of a man once," he said. "A man who swore to protect the innocent. I came to ask if that man still lives." Eli almost laughed in his face. "That man's dead," he said flatly. Makoa didn't argue, didn't plead. He only looked at his daughters, then back at Eli, his voice calm but heavy. "You may think so," the chief said quietly. "My daughters cannot afford to believe it." The morning Chief Makoa rode onto Eli Barrett's land. The sky was an endless pale blue, soft and empty like a clean page waiting to be written on. Eli stood on the porch with his coffee cooling in his hand, Duke sitting at his boots, watching the 3 riders pick their way across the dry gulch below. By the time they reached the cabin, Eli had already set his cup aside and laid his rifle across his knees. He wasn't expecting trouble, but he'd learned long ago not to trust unannounced company. Chief Makoa dismounted first, landing on the earth like a man who had never once questioned his place upon it. His broad shoulders carried years of command, his braided hair threaded with tiny beads of copper and bone that caught the sun like sparks. Lena and Maris followed close behind, both sliding off their Appaloosas without a sound. The older daughter, Lena, had a quiet gravity about her. Dark braids framed a face carved by patience and strength, her gaze steady and unflinching. She didn't fidget, didn't glance around, just stood like stone and watched Eli with those deep, unreadable eyes. Maris was the opposite in every way. The younger girl practically vibrated with restless energy. Her wild black hair came loose around her shoulders, and her sharp gaze darted over everything: Duke, the cabin, the rifle across Eli's knees. She seemed to drink in the world with an untamed hunger, as though she carried lightning under her skin. Eli said nothing at first, only tipped his hat slightly, his boot tapping slow against the porch rail. Makoa broke the silence. "My name is Makoa," he said, his voice low and measured, each word chosen carefully. "These are my daughters, Lena and Maris." Eli nodded once, waiting. "The red jackals," Makoa continued, "are hunting us." The name made Eli's jaw tighten. Even out here, on the edge of nowhere, word of the red jackals had drifted like smoke on the wind. They were outlaws without honor, a pack of riders bound by blood and greed, their banner daubed with crude fangs in red paint. No one survived crossing them. "They want my daughters," Makoa said simply, as if stating the weather. Eli leaned back in his chair, one hand resting lazily on the rifle stock, though every muscle beneath his shirt had gone taut. "What's that got to do with me?" he asked. Makoa's gaze didn't waver. "I heard of a man once," he said. "A man who swore to protect the innocent. They said he wore a badge. They said his aim was true." Eli snorted without humor. "That man's dead." Maris frowned at him like he'd spoken blasphemy. Lena didn't move, didn't blink, just kept her gaze on him like she was weighing his soul. Makoa nodded slowly, as though he'd expected Eli's answer. "You may think so," he said softly. "My daughters cannot afford to believe it." With that, the chief swung himself back into the saddle, his daughters following suit. Without another word, the three of them rode off into the desert light, their silhouettes swallowed by the heat haze until they disappeared entirely. Eli watched them go, jaw tight, pulse pounding harder than he wanted to admit. That night, Eli sat on the porch long after sundown, Duke curled at his feet. The mesa stretched endlessly before him, bathed in cold silver moonlight. He told himself he wanted no part of it. No part of their fight, no part of their danger, no part of their lives. But he couldn't shake the way Lena's gaze had pinned him, quiet and patient, as if she'd already decided he'd help, as if she knew something he didn't. The next morning, Eli found a neat stack of kindling set against his porch rail. Dry, trimmed branches, bundled tight with a strip of leather. He frowned, glanced toward the horizon, but saw no sign of riders. The day after that, he found a satchel of dried corn, stitched with small Comanche symbols along the edges. Symbols he didn't understand but somehow recognized as words of thanks. The third morning, Lena herself came. She didn't knock, didn't speak, just set a small carved figurine. A coyote, teeth bared, crouched to leap, on the porch and walked away, her braids swinging against the small of her back. Eli watched her go, the figurine heavy in his palm. He thought about throwing it into the fire. He didn't. 3 days later, Eli was riding the north ridge to check a busted fence line when he spotted dust clouds on the horizon. He reined Duke hard, squinting against the glare. Riders. 6 of them, maybe 7. They came fast, cutting across the basin like wolves on the hunt. Even from this distance, Eli could see the marks on their horses' hides. Jagged, crude red streaks painted along their flanks. The red jackals. Eli turned his horse downhill and rode hard for the cabin, keeping low in the saddle. The jackals didn't follow, but they didn't need to. Their path had carried them too close to his land, their eyes sharp and hungry when they turned his way. That night, Eli cleaned his rifle 3 times and couldn't sleep. The jackals began circling the Comanche camp after that, leaving tracks in the dust, their laughter carrying on the night wind. And Lena kept coming. Sometimes she'd walk the fence line in silence, leaving small bundles of sage tied with leather strips. Other times she'd sit on a flat rock near his pasture, hands folded neatly in her lap, saying nothing at all until sunset. Maris came too, but only once. She asked questions Eli refused to answer, teased him for being old, accused him of being afraid. Her sharp, wild energy was a storm compared to her sister's quiet persistence. Eli tried to ignore them both. He fixed fences, rode the mesa, and buried himself in work. But every time he closed his eyes, he saw the preacher's family, saw graves under the oak tree, saw the dead he'd already failed. And every time, he heard Makoa's voice, calm and unyielding. "I came to ask if that man still lives." One night, as Eli sat nursing a bottle on the porch, Duke's ears pricked up. A low growl rolled from his chest. A moment later, a single rifle shot cracked the air sharp, close. Eli's heart stuttered. When he went inside, he found a bullet lodged deep in his cabin door. The message was clear. The jackals weren't just hunting the Comanche anymore. They were watching him too. Eli sat there in the quiet, the spent casing between his fingers, his jaw tight as stone. He had spent 6 years running from the world. But the world had finally caught up. Eli Barrett had spent 6 years believing he had left the world behind. 6 years on the far edge of Raven Mesa, where the wind scoured the red rocks clean and the horizon stretched out like endless judgment. He believed in solitude. He believed in regret. He believed that if he never promised anything, if he never intervened, if he never answered a call, then perhaps the past could stay buried, and no one else would die under his watch. And then the small, deliberate acts began. It started with a neat stack of kindling on his porch. Each branch trimmed, tied with leather strips, placed with care. No note, no sound of footsteps, just the kindling waiting. Eli frowned, his hand brushing the rough wood. He didn't understand why it unsettled him so much, why the sight of someone caring enough to leave it made his chest tighten. He had long ago stopped caring. He had long ago stopped noticing the world beyond his own land. The next morning, a satchel of dried corn appeared, stitched with small Comanche symbols along the seams. He didn't know the language, but he recognized it as a gesture of trust, of acknowledgement. It was small, simple, yet heavier than any burden he had carried in years. Then Lena came. She didn't knock. She didn't speak. She simply approached, careful and quiet, her boots brushing the earth like wind over the prairie. She placed a small carved figure on the porch. A coyote, crouched, teeth bared, ready to spring. Her gaze met Eli's as she stepped back, and he felt, with sharp clarity, the weight of her expectation. She believes I can help. He wanted to deny it. He wanted to tell her she was too young, too strong, too foolish to rely on a broken man like him. He wanted to stay in the cabin, in the mesa, in the quiet. He wanted to believe that safety existed somewhere outside the reach of the red jackals and the consequences of a past life. But he couldn't. The red jackals came next. He saw them riding past his land 2 days later, dust clouds spiraling in the morning sun, hands resting on revolvers, eyes glinting with cruelty. Eli's stomach twisted. The threat was no longer distant. It was close, closer than he had allowed himself to imagine. That night he sat on the porch, Duke at his feet, rifle across his knees. The moon hung low and pale over Raven Mesa. He stared at the horizon, listening to the wind whisper across the red rock, and felt the slow, insistent pull of responsibility. The Comanche girls were out there. Makoa was out there, and they had made it clear without words that they trusted him, that they believed he could act. Every instinct screamed run. Every memory screamed stay hidden. But Eli Barrett knew, deep down, that if he stayed hidden, death would come anyway. And this time he would not survive watching others fall. Not again. The next morning, Lena was at the fence line, walking in silence. Each step measured, deliberate, leaving small bundles of sage tied with leather strips at regular intervals. She did not speak, did not glance his way, yet the meaning was unmistakable. I am here. I need you. Maris followed 2 days later. Unlike her sister, she spoke constantly, challenging him, teasing him for every hesitant movement, questioning every pause. Her energy was relentless, wild, almost unbearable. But Eli realized that her fearlessness was born from the same need that had brought Lena to the fence: survival. And slowly, imperceptibly, their persistence chipped at the walls he had spent years building. One evening, after a long day of checking fences and mending gates, Eli returned to the porch to find another bundle. This one held a small loaf of bread, a carving of a horse, and a note scrawled in careful English. You are our hope. We believe in you. Please, come. He held the note in his hands, worn and trembling. The words were simple, but their weight pressed against his chest like a stone. He had spent 6 years running from responsibility, from the pain of failure, from the ghosts that followed him across every mesa and canyon. Now someone was asking him to stand, not for coin, not for fame, but for trust, for life itself. Eli set his jaw, ran his fingers over the rifle on his lap, and thought of the preacher's family buried under the lone oak tree back in Dry Creek. The memory surged up like fire. Every mistake, every death, every failure demanded repayment. The next day he spotted the red jackals again. 6, maybe 7 riders, moving fast, scanning the horizon, their horses' hoofs tearing dust into the wind. Eli's hands tightened on the reins. Duke growled low at his side. The jackals had come closer, testing him, daring him to intervene. Eli did not hesitate. He saddled his horse with precise, deliberate motions, every muscle taut, every nerve alive. He swung into the saddle, Duke following silently. He rode hard across the mesa, the wind whipping his coat, dust in his eyes, heart hammering like a drum in his chest. For a moment, every step, every gallop felt like redemption in motion, a reclamation of the man he had been, the man he had believed was dead. When he reached the Comanche camp, it was quiet, small fires flickering against the night. Lena and Maris were there, tending the flames, shadows dancing across their faces. Makoa sat near the edge of the camp, bowing his head, tense but steady. Eli dismounted, his boots crunched on dry earth. He laid the rifle down by the fire, steady and unwavering. "One word," he said, voice rough from disuse. "All right." The word carried more weight than 1,000 bullets. It was a vow, silent but binding. A choice, a declaration. He would no longer hide. He would no longer run. Makoa looked up, relief flickering like candlelight across his face. Lena's dark eyes held his gaze, steady, calm, unflinching, weighing the measure of the man before her. Maris's gaze sparkled with challenge, but also hope. For the first time in 6 years, Eli Barrett felt something he had not allowed himself to feel: purpose. The storm was coming. The red jackals would not wait. But for the first time in years, Eli Barrett was ready. He had stepped forward. And in that moment, under the vast, open sky of Raven Mesa, he felt the faint, stubborn pulse of life. And a man who had once believed he was dead could finally feel alive again. The morning after Eli Barrett pledged himself to the Comanche camp, the mesa felt smaller. The wind cut sharper, carrying the scent of dust and sage, the smell of distant danger curling in on him like smoke from a fire he could not see. Even Duke, normally indifferent to the movements of strangers, stayed close at his heels, ears pricked and hackles low, warning of shadows that had yet to emerge. By noon, the first whispers arrived. They came from the direction of Dry Creek, drifting across the prairie like venom carried on the wind. Men Eli had once called friends, men who had laughed with him over whiskey, shared a cigar at the saloon, or nodded at him in silent acknowledgement of shared history, now spat their contempt at his boots. Their voices carried on the wind, sharp and bitter. "Savage lover," one called, leaning from his horse with a sneer. "Protecting the Comanche now, eh? Disgraceful," another shouted. Eli didn't respond. He let the words roll over him like rain over stone, but the ache in his chest was undeniable. This was a different kind of danger, one measured in human hate, human fear, human ignorance. Even before the jackals arrived, the town had turned its teeth on him, and the red jackals were coming. Riding past his land in the late afternoon, they were more than a threat now. They were a storm, an approaching reckoning. Eli watched from a ridge, squinting against the sun. 10 riders, possibly more, their horses kicking up clouds of red dust, weapons ready, eyes alive with malice. Their banner, a crude painting of fangs and blood, flapped against the wind like a warning from hell itself. Eli counted them carefully. He memorized the edges of their formation, the way the younger men shifted in the saddles, the tension in their shoulders. Each move was deliberate, each pause a signal. They were not just hunting the Comanche. They were testing him, watching, daring him to step into the fight. And for the first time in years, Eli Barrett felt the pulse of fear in his chest. Not for himself, but for Lena, Maris, and Makoa. That night, the first warning arrived. A single rifle shot cracked the air, embedding a bullet deep in Eli's cabin door. He found it at sunrise, splintered wood and scorched edges still smoldering. Duke growled low in the corner, tail stiff. Eli's jaw tightened. Whoever had fired that shot had measured him. They had sought to intimidate, to make him hesitate. But Eli had not hesitated. Not yet. He rode to the Comanche camp before noon, the day thick with dust and wind. Lena and Maris were tending the fire, small movements precise, deliberate, almost ceremonial. Makoa's head was bowed as he patched a saddle, aware of the danger pressing in like the heat off the mesa. Eli didn't speak at first. He dismounted, boots crunching on dry earth, and laid his rifle down by the fire with quiet authority. Enough, he said. Simple. Low. Certain. Lena met his gaze, her dark eyes steady. Maris twitched, restless as ever, but her body relaxed slightly. Even Makoa looked up, measuring the man who had once claimed to be dead. The red jackals didn't wait. That night, the sky darkened with low clouds, thunder rolling distant but inevitable. Lightning forked across the horizon as the riders struck the Comanche camp, their shadows dancing like wraiths under the storm. Eli, waiting on the ridge, felt the ground vibrate with the pounding of hooves. By the time he reached the edge of the camp, chaos ruled. Horses screamed in terror, tents burned, and the scent of smoke filled the air. Men shouted, weapons fired indiscriminately, and the red jackal's laughter carried over the roar of thunder. Eli took stock. Lena and Maris were moving quickly, dragging supplies and helping the wounded. The jackals had spread thin, their formation broken in the stampede. Each shot he fired from the ridge was measured, precise. Every target he took down shifted the balance, giving the girls and their father a chance to survive another moment. The town's disdain followed him like a shadow even here. He had not only crossed the red jackals, he had defied every whisper, every judgment, every sneer of the men who had once called him brother. The world had become a crucible, testing the limits of his resolve, challenging every belief he had built since that night in Dry Creek. As night deepened, Eli saw the jackals retreat, their numbers thinned, their anger palpable. Smoke curled from the campfires, and the Comanche women moved with careful precision, stabilizing what they could. The wind carried the acrid scent of fire and fear, but also something else, a sense of fragile survival. Eli stood alone at the ridge's edge, Duke growling softly at his side, rifle in hand, listening to the distant echoes of retreating hooves. He knew this was not the end. The red jackals would return, stronger, faster, more relentless. But for the first time in years, Eli Barrett felt something else beneath the tension, beneath the threat, beneath the weight of both town and outlaw alike. He felt resolve. He had stepped forward. He had chosen. And now, no matter how dark the night, no matter how vicious the enemies, he would stand. The storm had come. The world had turned its teeth on him. And yet, here he was, unbroken, watching over the people who had placed their trust in him, and he would not fail again. Because sometimes survival was not enough. Sometimes a man had to rise not just to save himself, but to protect the lives that could not protect themselves. Eli Barrett was ready. The storm had arrived in full fury by the time Eli Barrett reached the Comanche camp. Rain fell in thick, cold sheets, slamming against the earth and turning the dry mesa dust into mud. Lightning split the sky in jagged veins, illuminating the chaos below for fleeting, cruel moments. The camp was a tangle of fire, smoke, and terrified voices, tents collapsing under the wind's assault. Eli's heart pounded as he dismounted, boots sinking into the mud. Duke growled low, tail stiff, one good eye scanning for danger. Every muscle in Eli's body was taut with years of experience, fear, and adrenaline. The red jackals had already reached the camp, circling like vultures, their horses snorting, hooves churning the mud, weapons raised, eyes gleaming with malice. He spotted Maris first, pinned under a splintered tent frame. Her legs were trapped, her small hands scraping at the timber, her breath ragged. Eli sprinted across the mud, rifle slung over his shoulder, rain plastering his hair to his forehead. He reached her in 2 strides, lifting the beam with a grunt of effort. The wood bit into his palms, but he didn't falter. With a final heave, he freed her. Maris stumbled to her feet, soaked, shivering, but alive. Her wild eyes found his, and for a brief heartbeat, Eli saw not fear, but recognition. Trust, unspoken but complete. Lena was beside their father, dragging him through the mud to higher ground. Makoa's face was pale, rain streaking his cheeks, but his grip on his rifle remained steady. The jackals were closing, reckless now, emboldened by the storm and the chaos. Eli's mind raced. There was no time for hesitation, no room for error. Every second mattered. He raised his rifle. 2 shots rang out, cracking through the storm. 2 jackals dropped, faces twisting in shock and pain as their horses bolted. Eli didn't pause to mourn them. There was no time. Each pull of the trigger was calculated, precise, saving the lives that mattered. Maris scrambled behind him, clutching his coat for balance as they moved toward the fire's edge. Lena turned at the sound of the shots, eyes widening with a mixture of fear and relief. Eli tossed her his spare rifle. She caught it instinctively, training the weapon on the remaining jackals. "You shouldn't be alone in this storm," he shouted over the roar of rain and wind. She met his gaze, rain streaking her face, mouth set in determination. "I wasn't," she said softly. "You just hadn't arrived yet." The words cut through the cacophony, grounding Eli in a clarity he hadn't felt in years. They were not victims. They were survivors. And with him there, they were no longer alone. Together, Eli and the girls drove the remaining jackals back into the night. Each shot, each maneuver, each shouted warning pushed the outlaws further until they melted into the darkness, leaving only the storm and smoke behind. The camp smoldered, tents reduced to tatters, supplies soaked and ruined, but the Comanche family survived. Eli sank to his knees in the mud for a moment, chest heaving, rain stinging his eyes. Duke pressed against his leg, wet fur clinging, whining softly. Makoa came forward, silent but steady, nodding once in acknowledgement. No words could convey the weight of gratitude, and none were needed. Lena approached, mud streaking her face, hands trembling but steady. She offered a small nod, her dark eyes searching his. Eli saw not just relief but understanding. A bridge had formed between them in the storm, unspoken, unbreakable. When the rain slowed to a drizzle, Eli rose, lifting a small wooden box from the edge of the mud. Inside lay a silver ring, worn thin from decades of battles, grief, and survival. His mother's ring, a relic of a life that had shaped him. "I didn't understand before," he said quietly, offering it to Lena. "But I do now." She took the ring without a word. Fingers trembling, she guided it onto her own. A silent affirmation that the past did not bind them, that survival and trust were stronger than grief. Only one word left her lips, soft but resonant. Now. The camp lay in ruins behind them, smoke curling lazily into the gray sky. But in that small, fragile moment, victory was theirs. The red jackals had been repelled, not by luck, not by chance, but by determination, courage, and unity. By sunrise, Eli stood on the porch of his cabin, 2 mugs of coffee in hand. Lena beside him, Maris at her father's side, Duke resting at their feet. No speeches were exchanged. No promises were made. There was only the quiet knowledge that they would face the world together now. As allies, as survivors, perhaps even as something more. Because sometimes, the strongest bonds are forged not in thunder, but in the quiet aftermath of a storm. Rain on dry earth, mud and blood and smoke. Survival, trust, redemption. Eli Barrett had returned from the edge of despair and chosen to stand. And in doing so, he had saved lives, healed a little of his own past, and discovered something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Hope. The red jackals would ride again. Danger was never far from the frontier. But for now, the Comanche camp had survived. And for Eli, that was enough. The storm had passed. The first rays of dawn crept over Raven Mesa, touching the mud-slicked earth with gold. The sky was clear now, the wind calm, carrying the scent of wet grass and smoke. The Comanche camp lay in ruins behind Eli's cabin. Tents torn, supplies scattered, ash curling from damp fires. Yet in the quiet aftermath, there was no panic, no fear, only life. Eli Barrett stood on his porch, shoulders slumped from exhaustion. Mud streaked across his coat. Duke padded silently at his feet, one good eye alert, tail flicking with a cautious curiosity. The dog's presence, steady and unwavering, mirrored Eli's own slow return to a sense of grounding. He breathed in the crisp morning air, feeling for the first time in years a tentative sense of peace. A small movement caught his eye. Lena approached, bare hands smeared with mud and soot, dark eyes sharp but calm. She carried something small in her palms, a piece of chard which she had shaped into a smooth token, a reminder of survival. Eli nodded silently. No words were needed. She handed it to him. The weight of it was symbolic, almost sacred. Maris came next, quick and restless as always. But there was a softness in her gaze, an unspoken gratitude. Even Chief Makoa moved slowly toward them, head bowed, carrying the tired dignity of a man who had watched his family teeter on the edge of death and survived. Eli reached into the cabin and retrieved a small wooden box, worn and familiar. Inside lay a silver ring, his mother's, worn thin from decades of life, battle, and sorrow. He held it carefully, as if it contained not just metal but every fragment of memory, every lesson learned through pain. "I didn't understand before," he said quietly, voice low against the morning breeze, offering it to Lena. "But I do now." She took the ring with hands trembling slightly, guiding it onto her own finger. No words came, only a single soft exhalation, a breath that seemed to anchor both of them in that fragile moment. Then, in a whisper almost carried away by the wind, she spoke one word. "Now." Eli felt the significance settle deep in his chest. It was more than a promise, more than survival. It was a recognition of trust, of connection, of life itself. The past, heavy and insistent, had not disappeared, but it had been tempered, softened, redirected. Redemption did not come with grand gestures. Came quietly in moments like this, in shared understanding, in the acceptance that one could act even after years of hiding. The Comanche camp would need to be rebuilt. Supplies would need to be restored. And the red jackals, relentless as they were, would surely return. But for now, in this small oasis of calm, there was safety. And more importantly, there was unity. Eli poured 2 mugs of coffee, the aroma rising in soft curls toward the dawn sky. He handed one to Lena. She accepted it with a subtle nod, settling beside him on the porch steps. No words were exchanged. The silence was comfortable, filled with a quiet understanding that had taken years to cultivate. Maris watched from a short distance, Duke curling at her feet. Even Makoa, proud and measured, allowed himself a small, fleeting smile. The storm had tested them all. It had torn through the mesa, through their lives, through the carefully constructed walls of fear and doubt. But it had also revealed something essential: strength, resilience, and the bonds forged in adversity. Eli took a sip of coffee, the warmth seeping into his chilled bones. He looked out across the mesa, the horizon stretching infinite and unbroken. The land had survived. They had survived. And for the first time in years, he felt a sense of quiet certainty. "Sometimes," he said softly, voice almost lost in the wind, "the strongest things don't arrive with thunder. Sometimes, they arrive quietly, unexpected, and they stay." Lena turned her gaze toward him, eyes meeting his with a depth of emotion words could not capture. She did not smile. She did not speak. She simply sipped her coffee and let the moment linger. The world beyond the mesa could wait. The danger, the judgment, the relentless passage of time, all could wait. They were here, together, surviving, thriving in a fragile equilibrium. The kind that did not require promises or speeches, only presence, trust, and the shared understanding that neither would face the world alone again. Eli's hand brushed the worn silver ring on Lena's finger. Not a gesture of possession, not a vow, but of acknowledgement. A quiet recognition of what they had endured, what they had survived, and what they had found in one another. The sun rose higher, scattering the last shadows of night across the mesa. Rain had soaked the earth, washing away some of the mud, but leaving a sheen of life on the rocks, the grass, the sparse trees. A reminder that even after destruction, even after chaos, the world could be renewed. Eli took a slow breath. He looked at Lena, then at Maris, then at Duke. The horizon stretched wide and open, endless possibilities spilling across the land. No grand declarations were needed. No future plans were imposed. Only this survival, trust, and the quiet knowledge that they had each other. The storm had passed. The red jackals might return. The town might still judge, and the past would never fully release its grip. But in this moment, Eli Barrett allowed himself to feel peace. And perhaps quietly, for the first time in many years, he allowed himself to hope. Because sometimes, the strongest love, the truest redemption, does not arrive with thunder. It arrives like rain on dry earth, soft, unexpected, and forever. Eli Barrett stood on the porch a moment longer, coffee cooling in his hands, Duke at his side, and the girls close enough to feel the warmth of shared survival. The world beyond the mesa could wait. The horizon stretched wide, alive with possibilities, and for now that was enough.